Richmond Palace smelled wrong long before anyone would name it. Servants scoured the floors with rosemary water until their wrists ached. Boys dragged braziers from chapel to chamber, swinging censers like tiny priests. Windows were levered open to the grey river air, then shut again when the Queen shivered at draughts that did not touch her skin. By dusk, the corridors wore a perfume of desperation amber and frankincense lavender boiled into soap vinegar, splashed in panicked arcs across rushes. Yet beneath all of it, something older and nearer seeped through the sweetness of decay that clings to living rooms when a body is already partway gone. The courtiers learned to breathe with their mouths and talk in half-whispers as if volume might wake whatever shadows she was arguing with behind the door. They called it corruption, the word used when meat turned, when wounds flowered wrong, when spiritual order faltered. In the language of the court, it was never her flesh directly, never the Queen's body, because the Queen did not simply have a body. She possessed, according to the lawyers, too, the body natural that sickened and aged, and the body politic that could not. The further her body natural failed, the more tightly everyone clung to the fiction of the other. So incense became policy, silence became loyalty, and a protocol meant to exalt the sovereign turned itself into a slow, ceremonial negligence. Physicians arrived and waited on velvet benches as if auditioning for a miracle. Their chests were lacquered with Latin, their cases fat with instruments they would not use. There were gestures that could be made, the pulse taken at the wrist through a linen veil. A cordial prescribed from a distance, a cool cloth offered to a brow you never touched. But the one thing that might have helped an examination was unthinkable. You do not undress, Majesty. You do not look beneath the architecture of pearls and paint and authority. Even now at the end, the law and the habit stood like guards between knowledge and need. Inside, the Queen raided rest from the margins of sleep. She had not lain down for days, then weeks. The bed stood monstrous a trap with curtains and carved lions and a mattress that seemed to breathe a stage set built for surrender. She refused it with the same stubbornness with which she had refused husband's treaties and the shape of a future that others thought proper for her. Cushions were stacked and restacked. Stools rotated in and out. Her ladies learned a choreography of human scaffolding, one behind to brace the shoulders, one at the side to steady the wrist, holding a cup, one at the knees to keep them from collapsing into a graceless heap. When she dozed, it was always upright, chin on breast, mouth slightly open, breath catching in a little soared rhythm that made even veteran attendants glance up from their needlework and count the beats. At odd hours, she spoke to people only she could still command. Sometimes to her father, and the ladies learned to hold their faces smooth, for there was a child in that voice, the child who had waited for footsteps in a tower that could mean love or death. Sometimes to men in black in the corners, whom she rebuked with a court politeness that sounded more terrible than anger. Sometimes to an empty space before her, as if it carried the weight of a nation, and she must coax it to one more year, one more summer, just long enough to finish some sentence history had not yet written. Outside, the council moved like patient carpenters around a listing house. Orders were drafted in neat, crisp hands. Riders were posted on the roads to Scotland and to every friendly channel port. Nothing was said aloud of heirs. Nothing was admitted even to themselves of time. In the presence chamber, gentlemen stood for hours with the rigid cheer of people who know that collapse is contagious. They traded morsels of gossip like protective charms. Her Majesty had taken a barley water, had asked for music, had smiled. Her Majesty had laughed. Her Majesty had been seen to frown. No one spoke of the smell, of course. It belonged to no sentence they were permitted to say. The sick room had its liturgy as Tudor sick rooms always did. Candles were replaced before they guttered. Books of hours lay open to offices for the afflicted, their pages turned, if not read at the appointed times. A bowl of sugared comfits sat near the Queen's elbow because sugar soothed like magic and because sweet made sense when nothing else did. The floor was strewn with fresh rushes and herbs, not only for cleanliness, which the aged could not quite command, but for sound. The soft crackle underfoot damped the sharpness of steps and made a hush that felt like care. A priest stood near often and often was asked to stand outside, for she had been politic in religion her whole life, and even at the edge there was a calculus in which the sound of Latin or English might mean more in the world than in the room. When the physicians were finally invited closer, their courage shrank to fit the rules. They bent, they peered, they asked questions whose answers had to be guessed at, because to ask too directly was to imply authority over her person. They prescribed possets lifted from textbooks and pilgrim tales powdered, pearl syrup of violets, a cordial of distilled roses and gold leaf whose glow in the glass promised a holiness that did not operate on organs. Some among them suspected what was breaking inside the liver, heavy with a lifetime's paint, the kidneys protesting the press of steel and whalebone, the blood thin with poisons whose doses had once been beauty. But suspicion is not diagnosis, and diagnosis was an act for which the realm had never written a script. Her ladies performed a different medicine, the kind for which history rarely makes a ledger. They warmed stones by the hearth and wrapped them in linen against her feet. They changed the ruffs and sleeves far more often than ceremony strictly required, not only to keep up appearances, but to replace the fabrics when they picked up the sweet sour taint, as if changing the garment might change the truth. They brushed her wigs carefully, as if the old rhythm of hairdressing could coax back a scalp that had long ago surrendered. They sang very softly at times, ballads from girlhood, snatches of psalm tunes, fragments of sound laid like cloths over a wound. Sometimes close to midnight she would straighten suddenly, and her eyes would clear with a terrible lucidity. In those moments she looked as she had at Tilbury, in the stories bright as iron will concentrated to a point. "Not yet," she said once to no one in the room. "Not yet, not while they are watching." And then the clarity went, and the corners filled again with visitors only she could see. It is one of power's most intimate cruelties that it gives you the habit of being looked at, until even dying feels like a public act you must choreograph. The bed waited. The doctors whispered. The council counted hours as if hours could be negotiated. In the halls, servants carried basins that steamed and lent a brief false winter to the air. Downriver at Westminster, stonemasons patched and polished, because honouring the dead in England had always been easier than helping the living. Across the Channel, men read dispatches twice and dictated incautious phrases about a sovereign said to be indisposed, a word broad enough to be a shelter and thin enough to be a threat. There were moments of tenderness that refused to become policy. A young laundress, new to court and bad at courtly stillness, dared to lift the Queen's hand when it trembled and press it between her own until the tremor passed. An old lady of the bedchamber who had once taught the girl Elizabeth to write a neat italic hand on scraps of discarded parchment held a cup to her lips and did not flinch when the Queen coughed and the wine came back pink. A musician summoned to play softly out of sight chose a tune too simple for state and too honest for comfort, and for a few measures the room forgot its duties and remembered only that it contained a person. And still the law of reverence stood between body and help. It was not malice. It almost never is. It was the ordinary obedience of good servants who had learned that to keep a monarch safe you must first keep a monarch sacred. That the altar rail protects and prevents in the same breath. In that space of protection rot works quickly. The candles guttered and were trimmed. The prayers were said again. Someone opened a shutter and the river air rolled in with its own litany of damp wood and fish and morning fires on the far bank. For a heartbeat the other smell weakened, and hope rose like a trick of light. Then the shutter was closed and the room remembered. Toward dawn she dozed in her upright fortress of cushions, lips parted, breath counting its way through pain. The bed threw its dark shape against the wall like a second door that would not open. Beyond it lay the choreography no one wished to begin, the knocking of seals from boxes, the drafting of proclamations, the race of messengers across rutted roads. Not yet, she had told the air. Not yet. The palace listened with all its timbered patience, and kept the watch that palaces keep over power, over rumour, over a woman who had made herself into a country, and who now in a room that smelled of death sat defying the last horizontal line. The lesson began before Elizabeth could write her name. 1536. The sky over London was grey and ordinary, the sort of morning that makes no promise, but by noon it would divide a nation. In the Tower Yard a French swordsman bowed once to the condemned woman and lifted his blade. The crowd hushed. A small girl, barely 3 years old, was kept far away, locked in her rooms at Hatfield. She never saw the stroke fall, but she heard the silence that followed. Anne Boleyn, the woman who had torn England from the Pope's embrace, the woman who had gambled a kingdom for a crown, was gone. The king's men wiped the scaffold clean, carried away her body, and set about revising the truth. The child she left behind was stripped of her title, called Lady Elizabeth instead of Princess. A new order was read aloud. Her mother's marriage declared invalid her birth. Illegitimate, her future erased. It was not grief that took root in that child, but comprehension. Weakness kills you. Being a woman kills you. Needing anyone kills you. The 3 axioms of her life were written that morning in her mother's blood. Henry VIII's court was not a home, it was an anatomy lesson in survival. It taught that affection was conditional, that favour was a chemical reaction of power and timing. Elizabeth grew up watching it happen again and again, wives offered to the altar of dynasty. Each of them became a chapter in the manual of endurance she would one day write on her own skin. Anne of Cleves was the first to teach the value of surrender. The German princess arrived pale, practical, unremarkable. Henry had chosen her by portrait and despised her in person, muttering that she looked like a horse. Within weeks, courtiers were whispering of annulment. Anne smiled, agreed that she had never truly been his wife, and walked away with castles, lands, and a pension that let her live in peace. Submission, she learned, could be freedom. Elizabeth would remember that sometimes the cleverest way to survive a man's power is to make him believe you are harmless. Catherine, Howard, Anne's cousin, taught the opposite, the peril of brightness. Though she was young, laughing, reckless, and thought love could be private in a palace where even the walls had ears, the courtiers adored her, the king adored her more until a forgotten flirtation resurfaced and turned into treason. When the axe fell on the girl of 19, Elizabeth was 8. She said nothing, but she never forgot the rumour that Catherine had screamed for mercy until the very end. Desire, Elizabeth learned, was a weapon pointed both ways. Catherine Parr, the last, taught the art of invisibility. Learned, cautious, careful as a cat around a furnace, she soothed Henry's temper with theology, flattered his vanity with essays about obedience, and prayed aloud beside his bed until he died. She survived not by passion or surrender, but by timing her silences perfectly. When reformers were arrested, she burned her Protestant books before anyone could search her rooms. When Henry's pulse failed, she mourned loudly enough to be safe and quietly enough to be forgotten. Elizabeth watched this widow, and found a model for the kind of queen she would one day become, one who speaks less than she knows and listens longer than is comfortable. In that strange menagerie of crowns and corpses, Elizabeth learned to treat language like armour. Every compliment had to be sharpened on both edges, too little flattery, and you were ungrateful too much and you were scheming. She learned how to kneel without yielding, how to smile while she counted betrayals, how to memorize who looked away during executions. The court was a place of performances, and she became its best understudy. When the courtiers came to confiscate her mother's possessions, Elizabeth thanked them in the perfect manners. She was 3 years old and already fluent in diplomacy. She kissed her father's ring when he visited, though she knew he would forget her name again by next week. She accepted the company of her half-sister Mary with the mildness of one who understood that family could mean danger. The courtiers said she was an unusually self-contained child. What they didn't know was that she was learning the one rule her mother had not: never let them see you bleed. The palace around her was both glitter and execution ground. Heads rolled, titles shifted hands like dice. Men who dined in silk one evening were dragged to the scaffold the next morning with their shirts torn open at the neck. Elizabeth watched small and silent from the edge of the tapestry where the children were allowed to play. Every time the guards carried a body through the gate, she added another entry to her invisible ledger: who spoke too soon, who hesitated, who survived. She began to think of life as an equation: ambition divided by caution, multiplied by luck, subtracted by mercy. Historians often speak of her brilliance as natural. It wasn't. It was engineered by fear. The court raised her like a blade, ground her to a point, polished her with humiliation, until she could cut through any conversation without leaving fingerprints. Tutors found her precocious, hungry for knowledge, especially languages. Latin, Greek, French, Italian, each new tongue was another disguise. In an age when women were supposed to be seen, not heard, she armed herself with words. Grammar was safer than gossip. Cicero could not betray her. But even a child genius is still a child. On nights when the servants whispered about her mother's ghost roaming the corridors, Elizabeth would ask her nurse if the Queen still loved her. The nurse would tell her yes, and Elizabeth would nod, eyes dry. Love was unreliable, but information was not. That was the seed of her future empire: knowledge instead of faith, calculation instead of comfort. As she grew, she saw how women survived not by strength, but by reading the temperature of a room faster than men could draw their swords. Anne of Cleves, compliance; Catherine Howard, folly; Catherine Parr, strategy; her mother, truth spoken too soon, each fate a page in a secret book she was already writing behind her eyes. Later, when she signed her letters Elizabeth R., she would trace the R, the sign of Regina, a little deeper, as if carving it into the memory of those lessons. The courtiers called her the king's little mirror because she resembled Henry the Copper: hair, the quick temper, the stare that made grown men stumble over their words. But the resemblance was deeper. She had inherited his appetite for control, purified of his appetite for indulgence. Where Henry devoured, she rationed. Where he acted on impulse, she waited. Survival, after all, was her inheritance. and yet beneath the discipline lay a quiet terror that would haunt her to her last upright breath, the fear of being seen as weak. Every queen in her father's story had died of it in one form or another. Weak faith, weak judgment, weak flesh. So Elizabeth began to build a fortress of composure around herself. Each smile measured, each gesture rehearsed, each emotion filtered through the question, "Does this make me safe?" By the time she was 10, she had mastered the art of absence, being present enough to remember everything but dull enough to seem forgettable. That skill would one day save her life in the Tower Charm armies at Tilbury and paralyse ambassadors across Europe. But for now, it was simply how a child of Henry VIII learned to breathe. The palace continued its rhythm feasts, executions, weddings, funerals, a litany that taught her history before any tutor could. And in the quiet after each death, the same sound returned: the closing of doors, the sweeping of ashes, the echo of silence that told her the lesson again. Weakness kills, the only safety is in control, and control must never sleep. When Henry VIII died in 1547, the kingdom exhaled a sound less of mourning than of fatigue. The great lion was gone, leaving behind a court of scavengers, a treasury full of ghosts, and 3 children who embodied 3 incompatible futures. 9-year-old Edward, the Protestant boy king, inherited the throne. Mary, the devout Catholic daughter of Catherine of Aragon, embodied a faith the realm had already begun to burn. And Elizabeth, the bastard child of Anne Boleyn, was neither one thing nor the other. She stood between worlds, too Protestant for Rome, too tainted for reform, too clever for safety. The safest thing she could do was to make herself useful. She did so with frightening precision. Under Edward's regency, the kingdom turned sharp toward Calvinist reform. Monasteries became rubble, Latin vanished from liturgy, icons were carted off like guilty secrets. Elizabeth learned to nod at every decree to attend the New English services with folded hands to let the bishops praise her piety. Behind closed doors, she studied both scripture and Machiavelli Greek and Italian. Because knowledge was neutral, it could be disguised as devotion or curiosity depending on who was asking. She learned to change the music of her speech so that every listener heard their own beliefs echoed back. To the Protestant tutors, she was a new Deborah, chosen to defend true faith. To the Catholic diplomats, she was a daughter of misfortune surviving heresy by obedience. To both, she was indispensable. She also learned the currency of visibility. When Edward's courtiers invited her to courtly entertainments, she came dazzling and cautious. She danced with perfect posture, sang with a clear voice, and never once allowed herself to outshine the king's own favourites. It was not modesty, it was math. The closer you stood to the sun, the faster you burned. Better to orbit quietly and reflect light rather than generate it. Then Edward died at 15, coughing blood into a napkin embroidered with gold thread. In his last months, he had been guided by men more zealous than wise, and they tried to pass the crown to Lady Jane Grey, another Protestant cousin. The attempt failed. The throne reverted to Mary Tudor, the Catholic half-sister, whose eyes burned with the certainty of divine vengeance. England had a new queen, and Elizabeth had a new mask to wear. Mary's reign began with processions, bells, and bonfires of celebration, but the air soon thickened with smoke of another kind. Protestant preachers were rounded up and burned at Smithfield, their ashes swept into the gutters. In the royal chambers, Mary prayed to an old god in Latin and began to search for heresy, not just in pulpits, but in bloodlines. The sister she half hated and half pitied came an unavoidable problem, a rival who embodied every rumour the Reformation had ever whispered. Elizabeth played her part perfectly. She attended Mass. She carried rosaries. She wept when the priest sang the Te Deum. Her letters to Mary dripped with filial obedience, every phrase rehearsed to sound spontaneous. But obedience in a tutor court was never enough. You could follow every rule and still find the axe waiting simply because someone else needed it to fall. The moment came in 1554 when the Wyatt Rebellion erupted an uprising against Mary's proposed marriage to Philip of Spain. The rebels spoke Elizabeth's name in their correspondence. One was even caught carrying a letter addressed to her. Whether she knew anything of the plot remains uncertain. It didn't matter. Her enemies needed a symbol. And so on a wet March morning, guards arrived at her house in Ashridge with orders sealed in crimson wax. She was to come to London immediately to the Tower. They put her in a barge on the Thames. Rain streaked her face as they passed under London Bridge, where the heads of traitors watched her go by skin parchment, pale mouths open as if still speaking. She sat upright, silent. One chronicler swore that when the gates of the Tower loomed, she murmured a prayer. Another claimed she whispered, Here died my mother, and here I come to learn the same lesson. Either way, she did not flinch. The Tower of London in 1554 was less a fortress than a museum of despair. Every stone had absorbed the memory of someone's last breath. The air was damp and metallic. Water trickled through mortar in the corners. Iron hinges sighed when the guards turned keys. Elizabeth's cell was small and windowed only by a slit that let in light thin as a blade. On the wall near her bed she could trace the faint scratches of prisoners who had been there before Latin pleas, half-finished prayers, names left like signatures in sand. In manus tuas, Domine, into thy hands, O Lord. She read it until the words lost meaning and became sound alone. The interrogations began quietly. A bishop would arrive with clerks pretending at concern Her Majesty wishes only for truth, my lady. They asked about letters, about Protestant courtiers, about men she had never met. The questions circled like wolves, each harmless on its own deadly in sequence. Elizabeth answered, with precision honed over a lifetime enough to sound candid, never enough to convict. When she did not know an answer, she made ignorance sound like virtue. When cornered, she feigned illness, swooning gracefully, so they had to carry her back to bed. The reports note she suffered fevers of the mind, which may have been true. Sleeplessness and fear produced their own poisons. At night she could hear muffled cries from the dungeons below, or thought she could. She learned the rhythm of executions by the echoing drums on Tower Hill, the sudden hush, the single blow, the cheer of a crowd beyond the walls. Every thud was a punctuation mark in her education. In the dark, she repeated her responses to likely questions, shaping them into a language of survival. Each syllable rehearsed, each breath measured. It was theatre, and she was performing for her life. The guards began to pity her. Pity was dangerous, but she accepted it as currency. One smuggled her a small Bible in English. Another allowed her to walk in the garden under watch. It was there, surrounded by the same ravens that had feasted on traitors, that she began to rebuild herself. She would pace for hours, murmuring verses and lessons, constructing within her mind a version of herself that could not be killed, a self that could transform danger into discipline. When weeks became months, she understood that she could not rely on God, justice, or family. Her survival would depend on something called a usefulness. Mary could not kill her if she could still be of use. So Elizabeth became docile, deferential, the model of repentance. She begged forgiveness for sins she had never committed. She praised the Queen's marriage to Philip. She wrote letters so humble they bordered on parody. And it worked. The interrogations slowed. The guards grew less watchful. She had turned invisibility into armour. In early May, word came that she would be released but not free. She was to be kept under house arrest at Woodstock, guarded, monitored, her correspondence censored. When the gates opened, she looked back once at the tower at the window slit that had been her horizon. Later she told a servant, "Someday I will return to this place as queen." But in that moment, stepping into the grey daylight, she was not a queen yet. She was something rarer, a woman who had survived her own obituary. The tower had changed her, more thoroughly than any crown ever could. The girl who entered was still half-child, a scholar, a daughter of disgrace. The woman who left was an actor, a strategist, a sovereign in embryo. She had learned to erase herself when seen to shrink until danger passed, and then to fill the space again once it was safe. The tower taught her the art of self-erasure, the ability to vanish behind the roles she played: loyal sister, obedient subject, Protestant hope, Catholic pawn. It was not bravery that kept her alive. Bravery was noisy and easily decapitated. What saved her was performance, perfect timing, perfect tone, perfect control. Later, when she ruled, she would command her council with the same weapons she had forged in that cell: silence that made men confess their fears, patience that turned waiting into dominance, and the smile that promised nothing. When the barge carried her away from the tower, spring sunlight struck the water like shards of glass. Somewhere behind those walls another prisoner was scratching words into the stone, perhaps a prayer, perhaps a curse. Elizabeth didn't look back again. She had memorized the colour of that place, the smell of the wet stone, the weight of being watched. She carried it with her, polished it, and one day wore it as a crown. Because in the tower she had learned the final rule of survival: if you can perform perfectly enough, even death will wait for its cue. The bells began before dawn, swinging so hard in their towers that the sound cracked against the winter fog. London, still half asleep, spilled into its own streets as if summoned by instinct. After years of smoke and executions of Latin prayers replaced by English, Then Latin again. The city was desperate for something that sounded like renewal. December 1558, England was getting a new monarch, and she was 25 years old. Elizabeth Tudor rode out from the Tower toward Westminster under a canopy carried by 6 burgesses of the city, the same institution that had once locked her away as a prisoner. The irony was not lost on her. The streets had been scrubbed for days, rushes, renewed banners, painted gutters, sluiced, but the air still smelled of tallow horse and thawing mud. From windows, apprentices leaned out waving branches of laurel. From balconies, merchants' wives dropped rose petals that turned brown before they reached the ground. At every crossroad, a tableau, children dressed as angels' choruses, reciting verses in halting Latin fountains that ran with spiced wine. The civic pageant had taken months to plan. The master of the revels had personally approved each actor, each costume, each Latin inscription carved into the temporary arches that bridged the route from the Tower to the Abbey. To the crowd, it looked like triumph. To Elizabeth, every arch was a test she had to pass without faltering. The first arch saluted her, as Deborah restoring Israel, the second as Judith delivering her people. Each compared her to a woman who had ruled under God's command and survived a world of men. Every allegory was a prayer disguised as flattery. Be strong, be chaste, be eternal, be safe. She smiled and waved, but her gloved hand trembled inside the silk. The people shouted Vivat Regina and meant it, but loyalty in England had always been measured by volume, not permanence. Inside her carriage, lined with crimson velvet, Elizabeth sat almost motionless. Her back braced by whalebone, her waist cinched to the diameter of a child's arm, she could feel the pulse in her temples where the gold thread of her wig met skin, rubbed raw. The procession crawled forward through a mile of humanity. Trumpeters rode ahead. Heralds on foot kept time with silver-tipped staves. Behind her came the peers of Mutton, bishops, judges, and ambassadors, a moving tapestry of jewels and rivalries. The Lord Mayor's men marched alongside holding torches even in daylight to make the air shimmer gold around her, a trick of optics that turned the Queen into something less human, more celestial. That was the point. Monarchs were made, not born, and making one required a small act of collective illusion. By the time she reached Westminster, the ceremony had consumed half the day. Her ladies helped her descend, lifting the skirts heavy with ermine, so the hem would not dray in the mud. The abbey doors yawned open, dark as a cave, and she crossed its threshold into candlelight. The choir began to Deum Laudamus, their voices echoing through stone that had already buried 20 kings. The air smelled of wax and wet wool. The crown awaited her on the altar, a circlet of solid gold that weighed nearly 5 pounds. When the Archbishop placed it on her head, the weight pressed down through her spine like a commandment. She would later joke that it had nearly broken her neck, but in the moment she felt the ache travel through bone to heart. It was not metaphor, it was physics. The ritual unfolded with precision bordering on cruelty. The anointing oil olive mixed with musk and ambergris was poured from the ancient spoon onto her palms, breast, and temples. The cold slickness made her shiver. The smell clung to her skin for days. The robes of state were layered over her until her own body disappeared beneath brocade and fur. 6 pages adjusted each fold so it would reflect light correctly in the chronicler's eyes. The sceptre and orb were placed in her hands, each heavy enough to bruise. Kneeling, rising, kneeling again, each gesture rehearsed, yet every movement a negotiation between majesty and pain. By the time she was enthroned on the marble platform, her breath came shallow, her ribs straining against the corset's steel. The audience saw composure. Her ladies kneeling for a few paces behind saw her fingers whiten around the sceptre's shaft. Outside, cannon thundered across the river, the blast rolling through the mist. Within the abbey, the final acclamations broke over her like surf. God save Queen Elizabeth. Trumpets answered, and the choir's voices climbed until even the clerestory windows seemed to shake. Somewhere high above, soot from the rafters drifted down like black snow onto her golden mantle. For a heartbeat she thought of her mother, another coronation robe, another crowd, another blade, and the world tilted. She steadied herself and smiled because the crown might slip if she did not. When the ceremony ended, she was led to a banquet in Westminster Hall. The hall's vast timbered roof swallowed the sound of cheering. Torches smoked against the winter air. Her courtiers dined on peacock pies, gilded marchpane, and wine spiced with cloves brought from the Levant. Elizabeth ate little. The corset left no room, and her stomach rebelled against the noise, the heat, the smell of roasted meat. Instead, she watched the heralds perform the final ritual of homage, A champion in armour rode into the hall, threw down his gauntlet, and proclaimed that anyone who denied her right to rule must answer to his sword. The crowd roared. The Queen raised her cup in acknowledgement, though the tremor in her hand made the wine ripple like a warning. When at last she was led to her private chambers, the servants peeled away the layers, one by one, mantle gown, petticoats, corset, until she was left in her shift, her skin marked red by seams and stays. The crown left a ring of bruises on her forehead. She stood before the mirror and examined the impression it had made, the faint dent where metal had met flesh. For years she would hide that mark beneath the white lead paint of state portraiture, but that night she stared at it as if it were a brand. Power, she understood, was not a gift bestowed. It was a costume worn until it fused to the body. Outside her window the city still celebrated. Fireworks burst over the river, bright petals falling into the smoke. The cheers reached her faintly blurred by glass and exhaustion. She thought of her mother's coronation 25 years earlier. Anne Boleyn, crowned in that same hall, cheered by the same city and dead within 3 years. England's love was loud, but it had an expiration date. Elizabeth knew that every hand clapping tonight could one day sign her death warrant. The gold on her brow was both armour and a target. She sank into a chair, muscles trembling from the day's ordeal, and let her ladies comb out her hair, red still for now. One of them whispered that the crown had made her radiant. Elizabeth smiled faintly, thinking of the bruise. Radiance was another word for endurance. The coronation had been magnificent, but magnificence was a performance, and she was the only actor who knew the cost of the ticket. When she finally dismissed the room and the torches dimmed, she remained awake, listening to the echo of bells rolling down the river. The crown rested on its cushion nearby, glittering in the candlelight like something alive. In the stillness she felt it again, the tremor that had started beneath her skin, when the Archbishop's hands first touched her, a vibration that was not fear exactly, but recognition. She would never be safe again, not from the world, not from herself. The gold would guard her and destroy her in the same breath. At 25, England's new queen had learned the same truth as the child who once stared at the Tower walls. Power is a costume sewn with needles on both sides. She would wear it for 45 years each year, heavier than the last, and beneath the fabric of triumph the tremor would never fully stop. The ink on the coronation scrolls was barely dry when the suitors began to arrive, first in letters carried by trembling envoys, later in portraits wrapped in silk, finally in the flesh-scented and armoured in equal measure. To the world, the question of Elizabeth's marriage was simple necessity. To her it was another battlefield, one where victory meant surviving unwed. Madam, her counsellors said England is a body without an heir. They were right. In Tudor arithmetic, no husband meant no child, and no child meant civil war. The Wars of the Roses still haunted the national memory like an old fever. The merchants feared chaos, the nobles feared poverty, and every foreign power saw opportunity. But Elizabeth understood that the crown on her head was not hers alone, it was bait. Whoever married her would inherit not just her person, but the machinery of England itself. To choose one man was to hand the keys of her realm to his entire country, so she discovered the genius of saying maybe. Her first suitor was Philip II of Spain, her dead sister Mary's widower, a king old enough to be her father and Catholic enough to turn England's fragile Protestant balance into a powder keg. Spain was the richest empire on earth, swollen with silver from the New World, but it came with an inquisition attached. If Elizabeth said yes, she would gain protection from France and the papacy, but she would lose her people. If she said no, she risked the wrath of the Spanish navy. So she said what would become her most famous word, considering. Letters crossed the channel, filled with polite ambiguity. Philip's ambassadors reported back that Her Majesty is well-disposed yet cautious, her countenance fair, her meaning obscure. It was exactly what she wanted, as long as he hoped he would not invade. Hope was cheaper than armies. Next came Archduke Charles of Austria, cousin to the Holy Roman Emperor. Protestant enough to please her counsellors, but his empire was entangled in continental wars that could swallow England whole. Marrying him meant trading independence for alliance, and Elizabeth preferred the illusion of both. She let his envoys think her interested, requested portraits, asked after his health, even dropped hints about dowry terms. But every negotiation ended in new paperwork and new delays. The Venetian ambassador, weary after months of fruitless meetings, wrote home that the Queen delights to dance between yes and no. It was not flirting, it was geometry. Each postponed decision repositioned England on the chessboard, one square from Spain's wrath, one step out of Rome's reach, one smile away from French envy. In this suspended motion her survival became national policy. Her council learned to read her silences as carefully as her words. When she said she would not marry without the consent of her realm, it sounded pious, but meant nothing. Her realm could be anyone in the room, depending on which room she was in. Eric XIV of Sweden tried next, sending her gifts, poems, and portraits that showed him as a golden-haired knight. He called her the Rose of the North Sea, and imagined an empire bound by Protestant brotherhood. England called him eccentric. His letters were too passionate, his crown too unstable, his sanity too uncertain. Yet Elizabeth kept his messengers entertained, hanging his portraits in her private gallery. When foreign ambassadors visited, they saw them and reported home that she seemed pleased by the Swedish attentions. Sweden preened, Spain hesitated, France recalculated. The game was working. Her most serious suitor, and perhaps the only one who nearly won, was Francis, Duke of Anjou, brother to the King of France. He was Catholic, but charming, young but shrewd, capable of flattering her vanity without touching her authority. She called him my frog, a term both tender and teasing. The court buzzed with rumours of love, pamphlets circulated predicting a new Anglo-French dynasty. In the streets, however, the people hissed at the idea of a Catholic consort. The Puritans warned of betrayal. Her counsellors begged her to reconsider. Elizabeth wavered not out of weakness, but calculation. She needed France's friendship against Spain. An almost engagement was worth more than a real one. The ambassadors described her mood as mutable as April weather. One day she wore Anjou's miniature on a ribbon around her neck. The next she declared herself married to England. Anjou left court dizzy with confusion, convinced that if he stayed a month longer she would either kiss him or execute him. Neither happened. He sailed home with gifts and a broken illusion, and Elizabeth's realm remained her own. To the men who sought her hand she appeared a paradox, a woman both coquette and strategist, all smiles and delay. But beneath the performance was cold arithmetic. Each match risked dividing her people along lines of faith and loyalty. A Catholic husband would reopen the fires of Smithfield. A Protestant foreigner would anger Rome and risk invasion. An English noble would tilt the balance of power and ignite civil war. Every no preserved her throne, every maybe bought her another year of peace. Her court learned that ambiguity was the new diplomacy. The Venetian ambassador compared her to the moon, which governs the tides yet keeps her own face hidden. The Spanish envoys despaired, calling her a princess who promises all and delivers none. Yet even they admitted grudging admiration. She had turned indecision into weaponry. In a Europe where kings fought wars over broken betrothals, she wielded uncertainty like a sword wrapped in silk. Privately, the strain showed. Each time negotiations edged toward a treaty, the headaches returned, the same dull pressure that had followed her since youth. Her physicians prescribed cordials and opiates. Her confessor urged prayer. She trusted neither. "Men wish me married," she once told Cecil, "yet not one can tell me to whom without giving England away." The remark was recorded as jest, but her fingers drummed against the table as she said it, betraying the cost of her calm. She understood perhaps better than anyone that being queen meant being watched by 1,000 eyes, some adoring, some predatory, and that every gesture could alter alliances across a continent. So she made her hesitation a mirror each observer saw in it what they needed to see. To Spain she was the pious daughter of a Catholic mother. To the Protestants she was Deborah reborn. To her people she was the Virgin Queen inviolate and eternal. The myth was beginning to crystallize, and she fed it carefully like a gardener pruning a poisonous flower. Behind closed doors the loneliness pressed harder. At banquets she danced with foreign princes and smiled for ambassadors' quills. In private she walked the palace galleries at night, the torches flickering against the tapestries of her ancestors. Her mother's eyes stared back from a painted wall Anne Boleyn, crowned, radiant, doomed. Elizabeth would stop before that portrait, sometimes lift the candle and whisper, "Not I. Not I. Not the wife. Not the victim. Not the execution's heir." Marriage was the risk her entire life had trained her to avoid. And so she chose absence over alliance, performance over possession, the crown over the cradle. To the world she remained open to proposals. To herself she was already wed to power, to survival, to the stage on which she would live and die. By the late 1560s, Europe's chancelleries understood the pattern Elizabeth promised just enough to keep hope alive and peace intact. Her unmarried status turned from scandal into strategy, then from strategy into legend. She has made her virginity her fortress, one ambassador wrote, and her indecision her throne. He meant it as criticism, but it was prophecy. For the rest of her reign, Elizabeth would keep her realm balanced on the sharp edge of maybe, and for nearly half a century that edge would hold. Robert Dudley entered Elizabeth's life the way thunder enters a summer sky, slowly at first, then all at once. He had been there in the background since their childhood at court, the boy who rode beside her in the royal pageants of their youth, the companion in exile. When both their families fell out of favour, the familiar name whispered, even in the years when speaking it too fondly might cost her everything. When she became queen in 1558, he was among the first she called to her side, and from that moment their names were never truly separated again. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-eyed, a man born for tournaments and whispers. When he rode at Tilbury or led the royal hunts, women sighed and men copied his stance. But what made him dangerous was not his beauty. It was his proximity. Elizabeth trusted him absolutely. In a court where trust was rarer than gold, that alone made him suspect. She appointed him master of the horse, a position that placed him constantly near her, guiding her bridle, accompanying her on progress, holding her stirrup when she dismounted. To the watching ambassadors, this intimacy was political pornography. To the Queen, it was comfort laced with peril. Rumour bloomed like mould in that heat. Courtiers whispered that the Queen and her favourite dined alone behind locked doors, that the candles in her private gallery burned long past midnight. Every foreign envoy wrote home a version of the same report. Her Majesty is greatly enamoured of Lord Robert. Spain's ambassador called it a scandal which, if true, would shake the realm. France's agents speculated that marriage was imminent. The rumour became a currency traded across Europe, its value fluctuating with every glance they exchanged. At first, Elizabeth let it circulate. A queen desired was a queen formidable. She had learned in the Tower how visibility could become armour. Now she weaponized affection the same way. So long as the world believed she might marry Dudley, no foreign suitor could be sure of her allegiance elsewhere. But the court had its own economy of envy, and gossip became poison. Married courtiers' wives avoided his eyes. Noblemen began to mutter that England was ruled by a woman bewitched. It was not true, but in politics perception outweighs fact. Then in September 1560, the whispering turned fatal. Amy Robsart, Robert's wife, was found dead at Cumnor Place, at the bottom of a flight of stairs, her neck broken. The verdict read misfortune, but misfortune rarely becomes a national crisis. Within hours the rumours ignited. Had Dudley pushed her? Had Elizabeth ordered it? The scandal was immediate and total. London streets filled with pamphlets comparing the Queen to Jezebel. The pulpits thundered. The Spanish ambassador wrote gleefully to King Philip that God has punished England's harlot queen. The damage was done before the body was buried. Elizabeth's counsellors begged her to dismiss Dudley, at least publicly. To do otherwise, they warned, was to risk rebellion, but she refused. "I cannot forsake him who hath served me faithfully," she told them, a sentence as revealing as any love confession. Still she knew the truth behind their fear. If she married him now, it would not be seen as love, it would be read as confession. To unite herself to a man accused, however, falsely of murdering his wife for her sake would collapse the fragile moral edifice she had built since the coronation. England's virgin queen could not become England's adulteress. For months she kept him close but untouchable. The courtiers watched, dissecting every word she spoke to him. He was at her side during hunts at councils, even at the nightly dances in Whitehall. But where once she laughed freely, now each smile was weighed. She turned flirtation into theatre, safe, glittering, calculated. Ambassadors took notes on the tilt of her head, the length of her gaze, the number of steps between their chairs. She became an actress, playing herself, performing chastity for an audience that demanded scandal. Behind the mask, the relationship deepened into something quieter, more desperate. Letters passed between them, filled with the kind of guarded intimacy that survives surveillance, half-coded affection, shared memories, the language of two people who knew that words could be weapons if intercepted. She gave him lands titles and the command of her armies in the north. He gave her loyalty beyond sense, enduring the mockery of foreign courts that called him the Queen's pet. They existed in the space between rumour and restraint, bound by affection that could neither be sanctified nor severed. The geopolitical cost of that affection was enormous. Every European court speculated endlessly on whether she would or would not marry him. France saw opportunity. Spain saw provocation. Scotland saw instability. Each alliance proposal began with the same question. Is she still besotted with the Dudley man? Diplomats wasted years attempting to calculate how much power he truly held. Elizabeth turned their confusion into leverage, dangling Dudley's name as a perpetual maybe. It was her favourite word once again, But this time the stakes were personal. When she considered the idea of marriage, it was always with the same impossible arithmetic. If she married Dudley, her people would revolt. If she married a foreign prince, they would fear invasion. If she married no one, she might die childless and end her dynasty. She once told her council, "I will have here but one mistress and no master," a phrase delivered with a smile sharp enough to draw blood. But in private, the loneliness seeped through. Her closest ladies recorded nights when she sat by the fire turning a ring on her finger, silent for hours. She would ask after Dudley's health as if he were just another courtier, then change the subject before they could answer. The years rolled forward, their closeness ebbing and flaring like a tide no one dared chart. When he remarried in 1578, political prudence not betrayal, she flew into a fury that lasted weeks, then forgave him so completely that she made his new wife one of her ladies. The court saw humiliation. She saw control. She would rather have him near under another woman's name than far under another sovereign's. 2 decades later, when Robert Dudley lay dying at Cornbury, he wrote her one last letter. It was brief, affectionate and practical, signed simply "Your most faithful and ever-loving servant." It arrived in early September 1588, just weeks after the victory over the Spanish Armada. She had been triumphant, radiant before her troops at Tilbury, but now she was suddenly human again. Dudley was dead. She read the letter twice, then tied it with a narrow ribbon, and wrote on the outside in her own hand his last letter. She kept it by her bedside until her own death 15 years later. That ribboned page was her private reliquary, the proof of something real beneath decades of performance. Historians still argue over whether they were lovers in body. The truth hardly matters. What mattered was that each had filled the other's silence. For Elizabeth, whose entire reign was lived under a magnifying glass, Dudley represented the one human connection that did not have to be translated into policy, yet could never escape it. Even their affection was a function of state dissected, weaponized, and turned into legend. The rumours never died. They simply hardened into myth, a story told by courtiers and chroniclers to explain what they could not comprehend: a queen who loved and refused, who kept a man close enough to touch but too far to destroy her image. Love for Elizabeth was not escape from power, it was its cruelest echo. In the end, she ruled England as she had ruled her own heart, with tenderness locked inside a gilded cage. And when she died, they found the ribbon still there, darkened with age. The handwriting faded but legible. His last letter. It was the one secret she had allowed herself to keep. They called her voice too loud for a woman. The Venetian envoy wrote it, first surprised to find that the young queen's tone could fill an audience chamber without rising to a shout. The Spanish ambassador followed, noting a manner of speaking more soldier than lady. Others commented on her stride too long, her posture too straight, her complexion paler than health but stronger than fragility. None of it was meant as insult. It was bewilderment carefully recorded for kings who demanded every detail of the woman who now ruled England alone. To modern eyes, the descriptions sound clinical, even cruel, but to the 16th century they were political intelligence. A monarch's body was the realm's body. How she moved, spoke, and aged foretold the health of the kingdom. A queen's fertility was not private, it was policy. And Elizabeth's body, though wrapped in ceremony, kept offering the court a riddle it could not solve. There were the strange illnesses. In 1566 she collapsed with fever so severe her doctors feared plague. The Privy Council prepared for succession. Couriers waited outside for the signal to gallop to the tower. When at last the fever broke, she asked for a mirror, and reportedly said, "I am not yet fit for the worms." Her physicians were finally permitted to examine her, an act bordering on sacrilege. Wonder George Hewick emerged pale and trembling, his face described by a witness as like a man who had seen his own death. He refused to discuss the case further, even with colleagues. Within a year, he himself was dead. No official note survived, only the rumours that what he saw was not as in other women. Years later, another episode occurred. During a council meeting, she fainted. When her ladies loosened her bodice, one screamed and fainted herself. The others cleared the room. No explanation was ever offered, and no chronicler dared describe what they saw. In a court obsessed with gossip, the silence was louder than scandal. Ambassadors speculated in careful code. The imperial envoy de Quadra wrote that Her Majesty's form is not as other women's, while the Venetian noted she had no monthly distemper as others of her sex. The phrases were ambiguous by design, too plain, and they risked insult, too vague, and they risked ignorance. Yet all seemed to sense that something about the Virgin Queen's physical reality was at odds with the legend being built around her. Modern readers armed with medical vocabulary unknown to the Tudors have turned those fragments into theories. The most persistent suggests androgen insensitivity syndrome, a condition in which a person has XY chromosomes but develops outwardly, female anatomy, often tall, fine-skinned, long-limbed, and unable to conceive. It could explain her height, her voice, her failure to bear children. But we must tread carefully here. The past resists diagnosis. The Tudor physicians had no understanding of chromosomes, hormones, or even circulation. To them, bodies were alchemical maps of humours and spirits, not organs and cells. What they interpreted as divine mystery might now be seen as biology, or vice versa. What matters is not certainty but secrecy. If Elizabeth did possess any condition that rendered her infertile or different, it would have been the most perilous secret in Europe. A barren queen was a national crisis. A queen perceived as unwomaned could be declared illegitimate, even monstrous. Her entire political authority depended on embodying both sexes at once, the nurturing mother of her people and the virile defender of the realm. To admit that her body fell outside those categories would have dissolved the magic. So she turned the ambiguity into a symbol. The Virgin Queen was neither wife nor mother, neither wholly female nor male, but something rarer, a sovereign beyond the rules that bound others. This transformation from rumour to divinity was deliberate art. She forbade close contact even from her ladies. Physicians treated her through layers of silk. Bathing was private ritual witnessed by none. When smallpox scarred her skin, painters were ordered to erase the marks from every portrait. Her image became her second flesh, one that could not age, bleed or decay. The real woman beneath the paint was rarely glimpsed even by those who dressed her. When her ladies helped her into the tight corset that carved her waist, they looked at the floor. When they removed it, they doused the chamber with perfume before dawn. Reverence became camouflage. At courts, such mystery invited invention. Poets compared her to Diana, the chaste huntress forever untouched. Preachers called her the second Deborah chosen by God to lead men. Courtiers whispered that she was an enchantress, a spirit in human shape. Enemies abroad called her a hermaphrodite tyrant. Each rumour told more about the world that birthed it than about the woman herself. In an age when gender was destiny, a queen who defied categorization was both miracle and threat. It is tempting for us centuries later to want the final answer, the anatomical truth sealed in Westminster Abbey. Scientists have petitioned repeatedly to examine her remains to see whether bone or chromosome might resolve the enigma. Each request has been refused. Officially, the reason is respect for the dead. Unofficially, it is fear that the myth sustaining 4 centuries of monarchy might crack under fluorescent light. But perhaps the refusal honours her better than dissection would. The woman who built her reign on mastery of appearances deserves to keep one last secret. She made her body a political instrument, her ambiguity a fortress. Whether nature or strategy gave her that shape hardly matters. What mattered was the use she made of it. For 45 years, ambassadors would puzzle over her voice, her manner, her silence on matters of the flesh. She is not as other women, they wrote, half in awe, half in warning. They were right. The Tudor court, so sure that power must belong to men, could not comprehend a sovereign who embodied both its expectations and its undoing. Elizabeth let them wonder, and ruled from within, that wonder turning anatomy into mystery and a mystery into rule. Perhaps that is the truest legacy of her body secret, not what it was, but how she wielded it. In a world that demanded women choose between strength and purity, she made herself an emblem of both, and in doing so she blurred the line between the body natural and the body politicsy so completely that even death could not divide them again. For 4 centuries, the marble slab in Westminster Abbey has guarded its secret. The inscription reads simply, Elizabeth, Regina, 1558 to 1603, as if the dash between those numbers was sufficient to contain a life, a body, a mystery. Tourists walk past it every day, pausing to whisper or leave flowers. Few notice the thick seam of lead that seals the tomb's edge, a quiet assertion that whatever lies beneath is not to be disturbed. The Virgin Queen still rules in a way by decree of silence, yet her neighbours have not been so protected. Henry VII and Elizabeth of York were exhumed in the 1950s for forensic study. Richard III was lifted from beneath a car park in Leicester in 2012, his twisted spine and fatal wound photographed in surgical clarity. Even the bones of medieval monarchs have been scanned, measured, their DNA extracted and cross-referenced against living descendants. When the scientists petitioned to study Elizabeth's remains first in 1952 during the coronation of her namesake again in 1975, with the rise of non-invasive scanning, and once more in 2003 on the 400th anniversary of her death, the answer never changed. Denied. The official reason was respect for the dead, a phrase so often used it has become its own liturgy. But respect in Westminster has always been selective. The real reason whispered even among the Abbey's vergers is that the myth must remain airtight. To open the coffin would not merely disturb bones, it would risk unravelling the architecture of an empire's self-image. For scientists, exhumation is a kind of archaeology of truth. The methods are meticulous, the coffin lifted under controlled temperature, the lead lining cut by microsaws, the contents photographed before a single fibre is moved. Samples of hair or tooth enamel can reveal diet disease, even traces of cosmetics. DNA might confirm ancestry or chromosomal composition. Radiocarbon dating can authenticate relics. Isotopic analysis can trace the geography of childhood through mineral signatures in bone. In theory, Elizabeth's remains could answer the questions that have haunted biographers for centuries about her health, her infertility, her physical condition. But Westminster Abbey is not a laboratory, it is a shrine. To pry open its sacred geometry would be to admit that monarchs are specimens, not sacraments. The Church of England, which Elizabeth herself helped consolidate, has little appetite for that irony. Nor does the Crown wish to test the limits of reverence. The monarchy survives not by evidence, but by continuity, by the illusion that the line from the first Elizabeth to the second is unbroken and pure. A discovery that complicated that story, even one purely medical, would be political dynamite. Consider what exhumation reveals beyond data. When Richard III's skeleton was laid bare, the public saw not a villain, but a man his scoliosis and battle wounds transforming centuries of propaganda. When French archaeologists opened the tomb of Catherine de' Medici, the embalming fluids spilled, the jewels dissolved, and the queen became dust before the cameras. Every revelation diminishes the myth it touches. To see is to humanize is to dethrone. Elizabeth understood this instinctively in life. She curated herself as spectacle controlling what could be seen and what must never be seen. In death, the nation inherited her caution. Opening her coffin would feel like treachery against history, against faith, against the story England still tells itself about its golden age. Better to preserve the mystery than to risk the disappointment of proof. Yet one wonders what the coffin holds. A lead sarcophagus, perhaps two nested within each other. Inside the body embalmed in spices, wrapped in cerecloth, steeped in resin and honey, the face once modelled in wax before decay set in. The air within that coffin has not been breathed since Sin 3. To open it would be to inhale the 17th century itself, but with that breath would come responsibility to confront not only who Elizabeth was, but who we have made her. Historians argue that secrecy has its own theology. Myths function as social glue. They turn individuals into symbols, symbols into institutions. The Virgin Queen embodies a nation's idea of itself, rational yet romantic, proud yet imperiled, endlessly self-controlled. Her perfection requires opacity. If her body told another story, one of illness, intersex variation, or simple human frailty, it would rewrite not just her biography but the moral order that followed her. The Anglican Church, the Empire, even the modern monarchy all trace legitimacy to her reign. To question the vessel is to question the lineage. And so Westminster keeps its promise of darkness. The tomb is cleaned, the brass polished, but the lid stays sealed. Curators decline interviews, petitions vanish into bureaucracy. Occasionally, when new imaging technology emerges, someone suggests a non-invasive scan, ground-penetrating radar muon tomography, even infrared spectroscopy, but the Abbey insists that Her Majesty rests undisturbed. The phrase carries the same weight as the royal arms above the gate, immutable, unquestioned. It is tempting to imagine what would happen if the coffin were opened. Scientists in sterile suits flashbulbs the sudden hush before the first glimpse. Perhaps they would find nothing extraordinary, only the bones of a woman who outlived her own myth. Perhaps they would find confirmation of the old rumours. Either way, the act itself would change her from legend to specimen, from symbol to evidence. And maybe that is precisely why the door remains locked. For a nation built on ceremony, some truths are too costly to verify. The Abbey's silence, like the Queen's own, is strategic, a reverence that protects power as much as piety. Elizabeth, who once said she would not make windows into men's souls, has become the windowless room of English history. No light enters, none escapes. The coffin stays closed not because we cannot open it, but because we still need her to remain larger than flesh, untouchable, immaculate. In the end, Westminster's refusal is an act of national storytelling. The marble floor above her grave has worn smooth under centuries of footsteps, each one participating in that ongoing lie of perfection. The Virgin Queen sleeps beneath sealed in lead, her body still serving the state by doing what she did best in life, keeping the secret that made England believe in her. It began as beauty and ended as corrosion. Every morning before council, before petitions, before her own reflection, Elizabeth Tudor submitted to the ceremony that would become her most lethal habit. It was called Venetian ceruse, a cosmetic so prized that barrels of it travelled from the apothecaries of Venice to every royal court in Europe. White lead ground to powder mixed with vinegar until it gleamed like liquid pearl. Sometimes to make it cling they added a trace of arsenic because perfection must never flake. The mixture arrived in England sealed in blue glass jars stamped with the Lion of St. Mark. The merchants knew exactly what they were selling, death disguised as fashion. Venice had built an empire on such paradoxes. Poison turned to profit, alchemy to export. The finest batches came through Antwerp and Dover, their value measured not in ounces but in illusions. Elizabeth's ladies handled the jars like relics kept under lock and key beside her jewels. Every day the ritual repeated. First came the cleansing, a wash of lemon juice or wine vinegar, meant to purify the skin, but which stripped its natural oils, leaving it raw and porous. Then the lead paste applied with soft cloth or brush in slow, circling motions until the skin turned ghost white. The scent was sharp metallic, faintly sweet like rain on pewter. Over this base came rouge made of cochineal and egg white, a line of kohl for the eyes, and finally a dusting of powdered pearls to reflect the candlelight. The entire process could take an hour. By the end, the Queen's face was no longer a face, it was a mirror catching every flame in the chamber. Under candlelight, that whiteness became divine. The pigments refracted the wavering light, flattening shadows, and making her skin seem to glow from within. Courtiers described the effect in reverent tones. She shone as though lit by her own virtue. In truth, she was lit by physics, the dense lead particles scattered light uniformly, creating a luminous pallor no living flesh could match. It was the same principle that makes clouds' radiant opacity turned holy. In an age that equated fairness with purity, the illusion was irresistible. The ideology of whiteness was more than vanity, it was politics. To be pale was to appear untouched by labour, unspoiled by sun, a body set apart from the sweating masses who fed the realm. The Queen's ghostly complexion became a national emblem, a Protestant alternative to the painted sensuality of the Catholic courts. While Spain glorified dark saints and blood-red martyrdom, England celebrated its snow-pale virgin. Her makeup was not indulgence, it was propaganda. Each morning's mask was an act of state reaffirming that the Queen was both woman and icon human, and more than human. But lead is a patient assassin, it seeps, the same metal that armoured England's ships now invaded its monarch's bloodstream. Through her pores it slipped into the capillaries, binding to bone, to brain, to marrow. At first the symptoms seemed trivial: headaches, fatigue, mild stomach pains. The court physicians prescribed sweetened wine, fresh air prayer. Then the list lengthened. Her appetite shrank. Her moods sharpened into sudden tempests. She could charm a courtier with a jest at dawn and slap a lady-in-waiting by noon. As years passed, her handwriting wavered. Her hands trembled during audiences, her memory flickered. Insomnia devoured her nights. She would pace her chambers until dawn, the same chambers now perfumed to disguise a sour chemical tang that no incense could quite smother. Her ladies took turns keeping her company, reading aloud, singing softly, while she rubbed her temples and muttered that her crown felt heavier than ever. The official chronicles describe these ailments delicately as melancholy humours or vapours of the spleen. But the ledger of her body tells a clearer story. Chronic lead poisoning produces exactly those symptoms: headaches, abdominal pain, irritability, anemia, muscle weakness, tremors, depression, and insomnia. The colourless death she painted on her face each morning was accumulating in her bones, rewriting her chemistry molecule by molecule. The beauty that had kept her invincible was now eating her alive. Still she could not abandon it. Power once built on image cannot survive exposure. She was the England's sun, and the sun cannot dim. By middle age her natural complexion was mottled, her skin thin and flaking from years of acid and powder. To appear in public barefaced would have been catastrophic proof that the Virgin Queen was mortal after all. So she ordered thicker layers, even more lead, and new mixtures to smooth over the sores forming along her jaw and neck. Each layer sealed her closer to death, and each layer was necessary. One foreign ambassador noted that her skin cracks when she smiles as porcelain under strain. Another reported that she wore veils indoors to shield her face from scrutiny, though she claimed it was to protect against drafts. Her portraits tell the same truth in paint. As she aged, her likeness became younger. The later canvases, the rainbow, the Ditchley, show a flawless, ageless deity untouched by time. They are not portraits but counterfeits of mortality designed to overwrite the woman beneath. Behind that mask, her courtiers smelled the truth. Even in her final years, the rooms were aired daily to combat the odour of sickness that clung to her. The chronic headaches grew unbearable, sometimes that she could not speak. Her doctors bled her, blistered her, dosed her with mercury, ironically another poison. And still each dawn the ritual resumed. The nation needed to see its goddess radiant, and she obeyed because disobedience to image was heresy. There is a terrible irony in this, that the most advanced trade network of its age, the Venetian merchant fleet, brought her both glory and decay. The same ships that carried silk mirrors and glass beads also delivered the paste that would dissolve her from within. Globalization had made poison patriotic. The court apothecaries called it Cherusta Anglica once it reached London, as though renaming could absolve it. Using it became a declaration of national style. England's queen wearing England's own refined death. When night finally came, the ladies wiped the mask away with cloth soaked in rosewater and vinegar. They worked carefully. The mixture had already burned her skin thin as parchment. What remained after cleansing was not beauty, but residue, a faint powdery sheen of white that clung even after hours of washing. The lead had settled too deep. Beneath the rouge, beneath the rhetoric, beneath the crown, she was already a monument of her own, making skin turn to stone veins laced with the empire's trade routes. In the flicker of candlelight, she would sometimes catch her reflection and pause. The face that looked back was smooth, bright, perfect and numb. Perhaps she knew what she was seeing. Perhaps she thought of her mother, whose beauty had cost her life, and understood that hers would do the same. Still she smiled gently, mechanically. The illusion held, and the kingdom slept easier for it. By morning the ritual would begin again. A bowl of vinegar, a brush, a queen polishing her own tomb. The corset was her second skeleton. Not the lacy fiction of later centuries, but a brutal machine of whalebone wood and steel, a scaffolding, built to turn the soft, mortal curve of a woman into the straight geometry of a monarch. Beneath every gown, every jewelled mantle, there was this architecture, a conical shell that crushed the waist, flattened the bust and forced the spine into vertical obedience. Elizabeth's body, already strained by age and poison, was braced into divinity every morning, and released from it only at night when her ladies loosened the laces and the blood came rushing back. Fashion historians call it stays, but for Elizabeth it was more like a form of state apparatus. Her regality was performed not just with crowns and gestures, but with posture, the erect stillness of power. To slump was to doubt. To lean was to fail. Every ambassador, every foreign envoy, every court painter took note of how she held herself, how she seemed carved from the same oak that built her ships. It was an illusion engineered by inches of bone and steel pressing her flesh inward until even her breath became political. The process began at dawn. The room was cold, perfumed with lavender and starch. Her ladies laced her in teams, pulling in rhythm, two behind one, before tugging the cords until the edges met and her waist shrank by several inches. Never too tight to breathe, one lady recorded, yet never so loose as to seem at ease. The corset forced the ribs inward, compressing lungs to half their capacity, pushing the diaphragm up, so each breath was shallow, visible as a delicate rise at the throat. It straightened her shoulders and aligned her spine until she appeared taller than she was, her head lifted like a beacon above the crowd. It was posture as propaganda, a body turned into architecture. But architecture always demands a foundation and payment. Autopsy reports from noble women of her era read like blueprints of damage. Ribs warped into crescents, livers indented stomachs, displaced spines curved from decades of unnatural alignment. In the Duchess of Norfolk's remains, doctors found ribs fused inward, a cage within a cage. The Countess of Lennox's skeleton bore grooves so deep from stays that the impressions were still visible 50 years after death. Elizabeth's own body, when it was finally unbound, showed the same evidence, furrows etched in skin ribs bent toward the heart, as though the body had been slowly folding itself around the idea of sovereignty. The court saw only the outcome, a queen who stood unmoving through hours of ceremony, who could hold a sceptre steady while lesser men shifted with fatigue. Her stillness was read as majesty, as inner discipline. It was, in truth, engineering. The corset distributed the strain of performance, locking her torso upright so she could endure the weight of gowns that together might exceed 30 pounds. Layers of velvet, brocade and ermine were heavy enough to exhaust any normal frame. The stays made that frame mechanical, less body than mechanism. Her appearance of effortless poise was bought with bruises no one was permitted to see. Armourers of the day used similar techniques for knights preparing for battle. Both relied on load-bearing, designed steel shaping flesh for function. Elizabeth's corset was her armour, its rigidity a declaration that she was not like other women, not governed by softness or breath. The court artists exaggerated the effect, painting her waist impossibly narrow, her torso a gleaming triangle of order amid the chaos of male courtiers. Those portraits were not portraits, they were architectural elevations, blueprints of a political building that happened to breathe. The contradiction was cruel. The very device that let her project invincibility was destroying the body that wore it. Physicians noted her persistent shortness of breath, her tendency to faint in warm rooms, her habit of leaning discreetly on chairs when she thought no one was watching. Yet she refused to appear without the corset fully laced. To her, pain was not the enemy. Collapse was. Her people needed to believe that their queen was made of something unyielding, something more durable than the flesh they saw in themselves. One ambassador wrote that the queen sits as a tower unmoved while others tremble. He meant it as admiration. He did not know that the tower was braced by bone stolen from Wales and stitched into silk. Nor could he see the marks it left, long red tracks across her torso, healing too slowly, reopening each morning when the laces pulled tight again. Her ladies used powders of calamine and crushed pearls to soothe the sores, but nothing healed under pressure. The body adapts to what it must survive, and Elizabeth learned to distribute pain evenly and visibly. Comparative anatomy tells the rest. When 19th century doctors examined surviving corsets from her era, they noted how the stiff busks aligned precisely over the sternum, restricting the ribcage's lateral movement. Modern biomechanical models show that such constriction shifts respiratory effort to the upper chest, increasing fatigue and dizziness during prolonged standing, the exact symptoms her chroniclers describe. It also deforms the costal cartilage, a change that would have made lying flat later in life nearly impossible, perhaps explaining her refusal of the bed. The corset over decades literally rewrote her anatomy. Architecture and apparel conspired. Palaces and clothing followed the same principle: symmetry over comfort, appearance over air. Whitehall's ceilings soared, her corsets narrowed. Both announced order amid chaos, both hid their scaffolding behind ornament. When she stood in the great hall, glittering in gold lace and pearls, she was not simply dressed, she was constructed the human column at the centre of a living cathedral. The women around her understood. They wore similar stays, though less severe, and copied her fashion, because imitation was survival. The courtiers' wives competed for the smallest waists. Even foreign visitors adopted the style, exporting the queen's silhouette across Europe. Each corseted body became a devotional replica, a votive offering to the ideals she embodied. The empire of fabric extended as far as her influence did. At night, when her ladies finally cut the laces, the sound of release was almost obscene. A soft gasp, the whisper of linen sliding against skin. The air rushed back into her chest like water into a drained vessel. She would stand a moment gripping the bedpost for balance, the imprint of the stays still visible in her flesh, then sink into a chair while they rubbed her ribs with balm. The marks never fully faded. In later years they darkened into permanent grooves, purple and white like tributaries on a map of endurance. And yet she never complained. To remove the corset for good would have been to admit that her reign, like her body, had limits. She had been trained from childhood to associate discomfort with survival. The cage had kept her upright through decades of ceremony, through wars, betrayals, and the slow collapse of her health. To her, it was not torture, it was structure. In the final portrait painted before her death, the one where her waist looks impossibly small and her shoulders fan out like wings, the corset is invisible but absolute. It holds her beyond human proportion, turning pain into geometry, endurance into myth. That was the genius and the tragedy of Elizabethan design. Every wall, every gown, every body shape to proclaim perfection, even as it crushed the life inside. By the time they unbound her for the last time, the damage was irreversible. Her ribs bowed inward, her lungs diminished, her liver displaced. But she had never slouched, never faltered before her court. The corset had done its work, an architect's masterpiece built in flesh and bone. It held her upright long enough for the painters to finish their myth, long enough for history to take the picture and mistake it for the truth. She came to England not as an invader, but as a guest, or so she thought. In 1568, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, fled rebellion in her own kingdom and crossed the border seeking sanctuary. What she found instead was a gilded cell that would last 19 years. For Elizabeth, her cousin's arrival was less a family matter than a crisis of theology. Mary was Catholic legitimate in Rome's eyes and possessed of something Elizabeth would never have a son. To half of Europe, that alone made her the rightful Queen of England. From the first day, Elizabeth understood that her cousin's presence was an infection that could never be cured, only contained. So the English court built a quarantine of courtesies. Mary was housed in castles Sheffield, Tutbury, Chartley, each lovely enough to preserve the illusion of respect, but cold enough to remind her she was a prisoner. Her apartments were furnished, her meals elaborate, her household intact. She rode under guard. Embroidered, kept her chapel and waited. Waiting was her true punishment. At first, Elizabeth hesitated to destroy her. Killing an anointed queen meant killing part of the divine order itself. Monarchs were God's deputies. To execute one was to prove that crowns could be removed by human hands. The precedent was unthinkable, and yet as years passed, the letters began to multiply, the whispers, the plots, the coded promises. In 1571 came the Ridolfi plot. A Florentine banker, Roberto Ridolfi, carried ciphered correspondence between Mary's supporters and the Spanish ambassador planning to assassinate Elizabeth and marry Mary to the Duke of Norfolk. The plot was uncovered. Norfolk executed, Ridolfi fled. Mary protested innocence, yet her handwriting danced in the margins of those letters. Still, Elizabeth spared her. Executing Mary might martyr her. Keeping her alive turned her into evidence that loyalty to the old faith could survive only behind locked doors. Then the Throckmorton plot in 1583, a plan for a Spanish invasion with uprisings coordinated across England. Again Mary's name appeared in the coded exchanges. Her spy master, Francis Walsingham, was building his masterpiece, an invisible web of informants, intercepts and forgeries. He opened every foreign courier's bag before dawn and resealed it before dusk. His clerks grew fluent in invisible inks in alphabets made of birds and moons. To the Elizabethan court, espionage was theatre, a ballet of secrets performed on parchment, every stroke of the pen a calculated step. By 1586, Walsingham's patience had hardened into purpose. The Babington plot was the trap he had been constructing for a decade. Through double agents, he fed messages to Mary hidden in beer barrels delivered to Chartley. The letters were written in cipher, an intricate alphabet of dots and curls, and sealed with her signet. Walsingham's cryptanalysts cracked them easily. Each message passed through their hands, copied, annotated, and resealed so neatly that Mary never suspected the interference. When Anthony Babington finally wrote of assassinating Elizabeth and freeing the true Queen, Mary's reply sealed her fate. She approved the plan, asking only that her own rescue be swift. The dossier was perfect. It contained every element the law required, her seal, her cipher, her own words. And yet Elizabeth hesitated again. To sign the death warrant was to unmake monarchy itself, to announce that sacred oil could be washed away with ink. Her counsellors, led by Walsingham and Burghley, pressed her relentlessly. They argued that Mary's existence invited invasion, that every Catholic rebellion began with her name whispered in prayer. The Queen resisted, for months pacing the gallery at Whitehall, scolding her secretaries, bursting into tears at council meetings. Some called it calculation, others called it torment. Perhaps it was both. Finally, on February 1st, 1587, she signed. The act was administrative, a flourish of quill, a sanded blot, but its moral weight was biblical. "This deed will return upon us," she murmured. It did. Mary Stuart was executed at Fotheringhay Castle 1 week later. The morning was grey and cold. She entered the great hall dressed in black velvet, then shed her gown to reveal crimson beneath the colour of martyrdom. Witnesses said she met her fate with grace, praying aloud in Latin, as the executioner struck twice to sever her neck. The room fell silent except for the thud of her head against the scaffold, and the gasp when her little dog, a Skye Terrier, crawled from beneath her skirts, trembling and bloodied. When news reached London, Elizabeth claimed the warrant had been sent without her will, blaming her secretary for the haste. She raged, wept, retreated to her chambers, refused food for days. Courtiers whispered that she played at grief to pacify Europe. Others swore the anguish was real. Both can be true. She had ordered the death of her own reflection. Another queen, another daughter of Tudor blood, a woman who embodied all the things she could never be, wife, mother, mortal. For months she lived in a twilight of silence. Reports from her ladies speak of a queen who stared for hours into the fire, who snapped at musicians and ordered mirrors removed from her chambers. The court tiptoed around her moods. Foreign ambassadors baffled sent contradictory dispatches. The Spanish described her as hardened and cold. The Venetian said she was broken by remorse. Walsingham himself fell ill soon after, haunted perhaps by the machinery of his own success. But while Elizabeth grieved or performed grief, history moved. The execution of Mary Stuart became the spark Philip the Good of Spain had been waiting for his righteous excuse to launch the Armada. The two queens' cousins and opposites had finally completed each other's destiny, one dead by the sword, one made immortal by surviving it. In private, Elizabeth kept a miniature of Mary hidden among her jewels. No one knows whether it was pity or penance. Perhaps she needed to remember that the face she saw there was her mirror. The woman who had lived her alternative life, who had dared to love, to bear children, to fail publicly and die unrepentant. Mary's blood had bought Elizabeth another decade of rule, but at a cost that could never be accounted. From that winter onward, the Virgin Queen's brightness dimmed. She smiled less, laughed less, trusted no one. The poets began to praise her not as living glory, but as legend already half turned to marble. The theatre of power had consumed its last true rival, leaving behind a queen who understood more deeply than anyone else alive the price of her own survival. And sometimes late at night, when the palace was still, she would summon her secretary and ask for the letters again, the ciphers, the seals, the cracked wax. She would study them by candlelight, tracing the loops of Mary's handwriting, the identical forms of E and R, and whisper to no one, "This too is what queens are made of." August 1588, England stood on the edge of annihilation. From the coasts of Spain, an armada of 130 ships' galleons, Hulk's fireships had already set sail, 30,000 men strong, carrying the Pope's blessing and the promise of England's extinction. The plan was precise. The fleet would sweep up the Channel link with the Duke of Parma's army in the Netherlands and crush the Protestant heresy once and for all. The priests carried gallows ropes for the Queen. The banners bore Mary Stuart's son as England's next rightful king. Europe waited to see how fast the heretic England would burn. Elizabeth was 54, exhausted and in pain. The lead makeup had long since burned into her skin. Her joints swelled from the corset's daily siege. For months she had barely slept, signing letters deep into the night, her eyes red and trembling from the strain. Her doctors begged her to remain in London, but she refused. A monarch who hid behind walls invited defeat. So she resolved to go to Tilbury, where her army gathered to defend the Thames. She would not fight, but she would be seen, and that was the closest thing to a weapon she had left. The journey nearly broke her. Contemporary accounts mention that she had to be helped into her armour, a ceremonial breastplate worn over her gown of white satin. It was not meant for battle. It was theatre gleaming under the August sun, so the crowd could see the reflection of itself in her courage. She mounted a white horse so luminous that its mane looked powdered with silver dust. 2 grooms steadied her in the saddle, and a physician waited just out of sight, flask in hand, should the pain make her faint. The camp fell silent when she appeared. Soldiers who had slept in mud for weeks, men who had never seen her face, turned toward the figure emerging from the haze of dust. She rode between the ranks slowly, the wind tugging her red scarf, her breastplate flashing like a mirror. Those who were close enough said her lips moved in prayer. Others swore she was smiling. She was neither. She was performing, and the performance was perfect. Her speech, brief, improvised, unforgettable, has survived in a dozen versions, none identical, all authentic in spirit. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she told them, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too." The words rode the wind, simple enough for every soldier to understand, grand enough for posterity. It was a declaration not of strength but of defiance, a public rewriting of weakness into weapon. What they did not know was that moments before she rode out she could barely stand. Her ladies had given her a draught of wine laced with some stimulant to keep her alert. Her corset cut into bruised ribs, her legs trembled in the stirrups. Each breath was an act of will. Yet in that moment, for those 3 hours, she appeared ageless, invulnerable. The men roared, threw caps into the air, wept openly. They believed they had seen a miracle, and perhaps they had. In a world ruled by symbols, perception was miracle enough. Elizabeth understood stagecraft better than any ruler alive. She knew that what mattered was not truth, but transmission. She positioned herself on a low rise so her armour caught the light, so every man could glimpse her through the shimmer of heat. Her entourage fanned behind her like a living tapestry, standard-bearers, trumpeters, pages in livery framing her body as the axis of the realm. The chroniclers who rode beside her took notes, furiously recording every gesture to be carried back to London and abroad. Walsingham's agents ensured that the reports reached every European court within weeks. The message was clear: the Virgin Queen had faced Spain's juggernaut not from a throne but from a battlefield. The soldiers who heard her speak would repeat her words until they became scripture. Some swore that sunlight broke through the clouds just as she raised her hand. Others claimed to have seen her eyes glow with fire. By the time the news reached the countryside, she had already been canonised in rumour. Ballads called her "our Lioness of England." Preachers compared her to the Archangel Michael. Artists painted her surrounded by halos of gold. The performance at Tilbury was transformed through repetition and longing into a national sacrament the moment England's survival became faith, not fact. The truth of the victory was far more mundane. When the Armada finally entered the Channel, England's smaller, faster ships harassed it with long-range cannon fire, refusing the close engagement Spain preferred. The English captains Hawkins and Drake fought less like knights and more like engineers, using windtide and powder. Off Calais, fireships sent by night scattered the enemy's formation. Then the weather finished the work, a roaring Protestant storm that drove the Spaniards north into the North Sea, wrecking dozens of vessels on the Scottish and Irish coasts. God in Protestant sermons became England's admiral. While the Armada shattered, Elizabeth remained in London, waiting. Couriers brought reports in fragments, first rumours of victory, then silence, then confirmation. She ordered a day of thanksgiving, but privately she collapsed. Her hand swelled from the fever that had been building for weeks. She could not mount stairs without support. The stimulant that had carried her through Tilbury left her shaking, sleepless, and half blind with pain. Her ladies recorded that she wept not for joy but for release. For months she had stood against an empire. Now her body demanded its due. Still she appeared at St. Paul's Cathedral for the Thanksgiving service, draped in white and gold. The city erupted in bells and banners. Preachers thundered that England had been chosen by God because it was led by a virgin. The myth ignited a divine queen armoured by chastity, victorious through faith. Elizabeth's 3-hour performance on a summer field had become eternal. It did not matter that wind and seamanship had saved the realm, not angels. In the imagination of her people, it was she who had commanded the elements. From that day, her image ceased to belong to flesh. Pain, decay, and exhaustion disappeared behind the iconography. The Virgin Queen of the Tilbury portrait, standing beneath a rainbow with her hand on a globe, replaced the mortal woman who had coughed blood into her handkerchief after the ride. The stagecraft had done its work. For centuries, schoolbooks would remember her as the radiant goddess on a white horse, her words echoing like scripture across generations. Few would mention the trembling hands, the hidden pain, the physician waiting behind the curtain. But those who saw her that day carried a truth deeper than spectacle. For a moment their queen had turned suffering into strength, illusion into armour, and fear into unity. It lasted only 3 hours. But in those hours Elizabeth Tudor achieved what armies and admirals could not. She convinced her people that endurance was holiness, that survival was destiny, and that England, small, isolated and fractured, could defy the world simply by believing in the image she had created. 3 hours of immortality, enough to build a nation's myth and to bury the woman who made it. When Robert Dudley died in the autumn of 1588, barely weeks after the Armada's defeat, the victory bells were still echoing through London. Elizabeth had not yet set down her sceptre from Thanksgiving when the letter came. By post from Cornbury it read, "He was gone, fever said the messenger." She took the page, read it once, and folded it silently. Those present remembered her face turned the same white as her cosmetics, though this time the pallor came from within. For days she would see no one. She locked herself in her chambers, refusing food and counsel. When her ladies forced their way in at last, they found her sitting in darkness, still in the gown she had worn at the cathedral. The letter lay on the table beside her, tied with a ribbon. It would remain there for the rest of her life, marked in her own hand, his last letter. The world interpreted her seclusion as political retreat, but those closest to her knew better. Something in her, the last vein of unguarded love, had been cut. From then on she moved through the palace like a ghost inhabiting its own legend. The Virgin Queen had lost the only man who ever dared treat her as human. In his absence she turned to ceremony for comfort. Court became her theatre and her drug. She filled the void with masks, tilts and progressions, the grand spectacles that had always kept her emotions hidden beneath display. Courtiers in armour paraded as knights of the Phoenix or the Dragon, declaring undying devotion to their sovereign. Poets composed sonnets to her eyes, her hands, her mercy. She smiled, accepted their gifts, and played her part with precision. To outsiders it looked like triumph, the queen adored by all, courted by all. In truth, it was the sound of loneliness echoing through marble halls. Among the young men orbiting her new son, one star burned brightest: Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, Dudley's stepson, handsome, impulsive, 20 years her junior. He was everything Dudley had been in his youth, but reckless where Dudley had been, careful, vain where Dudley had been cunning. To Elizabeth he was an infusion of life. She called him "my boy," teased him, entrusted him with commands far beyond his experience. To the court the relationship seemed maternal. To Essex it was more dangerous. He mistook indulgence for love, love for immunity. The 1590s were hungry years. The treasury was drained by war in Ireland, by skirmishes with Spain, by endless patronage to keep noble factions loyal. The Queen's court had aged, with her half of her trusted circle was dead or dying. And the young courtiers who surrounded Essex mocked her behind embroidered sleeves, calling her the painted relic. Only Essex dared to answer back, and she adored him for it. His temper matched hers, their quarrels were fireworks. He stormed from chambers, then returned contrite, and she forgave him with laughter. It was the only kind of passion she still allowed herself, verbal, theatrical, safe until it wasn't. In 1599 she sent him to Ireland to crush a rebellion. It was his chance to prove himself the hero he imagined. Instead, he hesitated, parleyed, and made a truce without permission. When the news reached London, the Queen's fury was volcanic. Essex knew the punishment for failure, disgrace, possibly death. In panic, he did the unthinkable. Early one September morning, he burst unannounced into the royal bedchamber. The Queen was not yet dressed. Her wig was off her face, bare, her skin mottled from decades of poison. She had been sitting before her mirror, a frail, exhausted woman, preparing to become a symbol again. The door slammed open, and the fantasy shattered. Accounts differ on what exactly he saw, but every chronicler agrees that he froze. One said she was unready, her countenance decayed, her hair thin and grey. Another wrote that Essex looked upon her with such astonishment as to lose all power of speech. The silence between them lasted longer than any quarrel. Then he stammered an apology and stumbled backward, the legend he had worshipped suddenly replaced by flesh. Elizabeth never forgave him, not for his treachery in Ireland, not for his rebellion later, but for that single moment of intrusion. To see her unmasked was to commit a crime greater than betrayal, to break the sacred illusion on which her power rested. For decades she had endured agony to maintain the image of immortality. Essex, with one unguarded glance, had turned her back into a mortal woman. In 1601 he attempted a coup, leading armed men into the streets of London in a desperate attempt to seize control of the palace. It collapsed within hours, his supporters scattered. When they brought him before her, she would not meet his eyes. The trial was swift. He was sentenced to die. Witnesses said she wept as she signed the warrant. Others claimed her hand did not tremble. Perhaps both are true. On February 25th, 1601, Essex was beheaded in the Tower of London, the same fortress where Elizabeth had once waited for her own death half a century before. The circle closed blood for blood. Afterward she spoke little. Her courtiers tried to distract her with new pageants, but she found no joy in them. The tilts that once dazzled her now seemed grotesque, the poems insincere. Her palace, once alive with music, grew quiet. The mirror that had reflected her divinity now reflected her solitude. That single dawn in which Essex saw her face unpainted had mattered more than a dozen rebellions. It was the first time anyone had looked upon Elizabeth Tudor, not the Queen, and the gaze destroyed them both. He had witnessed what England must never see, the woman beneath the legend. For that he died, and she began to fade. The court whispered that her heart was buried with him, that the virgin queen who had never given herself to any man had finally been undone by the only one who dared to look at her without the mask. Whether true or not, her reign after Essex's death was shadowed the bright machinery of power grinding down to silence. The goddess had glimpsed her mortality and could not bear the sight. By the turn of the century, Elizabeth Tudor was living inside her own monument. The body that had once commanded an empire had begun to betray her teeth, gone breath sour with rot, hair fallen away, replaced by wigs so heavy they left grooves on her scalp, cheeks padded with cloth to mimic lost fullness, fingers trembling, unable to steady a pen. Her eyes, once sharp enough to unsettle ambassadors, blurred at close range. She refused spectacles. "They make a queen look old," she said, as if the denial itself could reverse time. Each morning the preparation took longer. The ritual that had once crowned her became an ordeal of engineering. Her ladies fastened the corset tighter to keep her upright, balanced the towering wig, powdered the neck to hide the sores. By candlelight she could still appear celestial. In daylight the illusion wavered. Courtiers avoided her gaze not out of reverence but out of pity. Yet her image grew only more perfect, and this is the paradox of her last years as her body failed. Her portraits became immortal. The Ditchley portrait, painted around 1592, shows her standing upon a map of England, a storm breaking behind her, and clear sky before Imperium embodied. She stands on Oxfordshire, her feet crushing the clouds. The Latin motto reads, "She gives but does not expect a queen as benefactor, not a woman who'd begun to lose her balance when standing too long." The artist painted her skin luminous without wrinkle or fatigue, her gown a constellation of pearls. Viewers saw not a mortal monarch, but the geography of rule itself. A decade later, the rainbow portrait took the lie even further. Commissioned when she was nearly 70, it shows her as a girl again, youthful, impossibly radiant, her hair flaming red. In her right hand she holds a rainbow. Across her sleeve coils a serpent of wisdom. Her gown glitters with painted eyes and ears, symbols that she sees and hears all. The motto reads, "Non sine sola iris," no rainbow without the sun. She is the sun, the centre of every light. Nowhere is there a hint of age or illness, not even the suggestion of gravity. This is not portraiture, it is scripture. The shift was deliberate. The painters were not artists but engineers of faith. Their task was to preserve regime, not resemblance. Each brushstroke functioned as policy, each symbol a replacement for the failing reality of her body. The courtiers who commissioned the works understood that England's stability depended on an image that could not decay. The woman was dying. The idea must not. By then Elizabeth's public appearances had become rare and choreographed like liturgy. She spoke from balconies but never at close distance. When ambassadors approached, the light was arranged to favour shadow. Curtains filtered the view. The glow of gold thread replaced the glow of skin. She was performing the absence of death while it gathered around her. Even the documents of the era, the proclamations, the coins, begin to flatten her features into emblem. The living monarch was already a logo. In private, the struggle was more naked. Her ladies recorded tremors that made it difficult for her to hold a cup. She spilled wine on her gowns and wept in frustration. Her joints swelled, perhaps from arthritis, perhaps from the accumulated poisons of the lead. She gnawed at soft foods, for her gums bled constantly. When she laughed, a brittle sound, her cheeks shifted unevenly, because the cloth pads had slipped. She knew this and insisted they be adjusted before anyone could see her again. Pain was acceptable, asymmetry was not. The court responded to her decline by building higher towers of flattery. Poets declared that she renewed youth by virtue alone. Courtiers likened her to the phoenix eternally reborn. The irony was cruel. They praised her for the one thing she could not do, live forever. The myth had become a cage, and its golden bars closed tighter every year. It is here in the late portraits that the true genius of Elizabeth's statecraft reveals itself. She understood that kings rule by fear, but queens by fiction. So she let painters and poets turn her into abstraction, and abstraction into stability. The rainbow portrait with its impossible youth is not deception, it is transition. It converts the mortal woman into perpetual emblem. By the time she died, the metamorphosis was complete. England no longer had a queen. It had a symbol called Gloriana. If you study those paintings closely, the angle of the hands, the gleam of the eyes, you notice they are not quite human. The body has no visible pulse, the flesh no temperature. The smile is thin mathematical, the gaze unfocused as though fixed on eternity rather than on the painter. These are not likenesses, they are apparitions. She is depicted as both everywhere and nowhere, the spirit of empire clothed in enamel and silk. Meanwhile, within the palace, silence deepened. Her old counsellors died or retired. The young one spoke to her as to a relic. She wandered from room to room, clutching Dudley's letter, murmuring to herself. The courtiers pretended not to notice when she lost track of conversation, when she forgot names, when she repeated stories. The tremor in her hand grew worse. She could no longer sign documents without guidance. Yet still she ordered new portraits, new pageants, new declarations of glory. The machinery of image outlived the machinery of flesh. What the artists omitted, the viewers supplied. They knew the rumours, the ulcers, the sleeplessness, the smell of decay masked by perfume, but the paintings offered a mercy. They showed the Queen not as she was, but as England needed her to be, a perpetual morning after storm, a body that cast light but no shadow. This was the final evolution of the mask. Venetian lead had preserved her kin for decades. Now art preserved her spirit. The rainbow portrait is less a painting than a mausoleum, the last layer of ceruse sealing her from time. When visitors today stand before it, few think of the woman gasping for air under her corset, or of the wig pressing against the sores on her scalp. They see only the glow, a face as smooth as porcelain, a hand holding the covenant of peace, a symbol too radiant to die. The painter succeeded where medicine failed. Elizabeth lives there still, not breathing, not aging, yet unbroken forever, poised in that impossible light. The flesh had surrendered. The fiction endured. In the end, she had become her own portrait, painted to last longer than bone. By the winter of 1602, Elizabeth Tudor had outlived everyone who had once called her by her first name. The courtiers who flattered her now were children when she was crowned. The poets who immortalized her glory were long in their graves. The great palaces she had filled with music were quiet except for the whisper of servants moving like ghosts. She was 69, her body a map of endurance turned to ruin. The mask of white lead lay untouched on her dressing table. "I am past caring what they see," she told a lady who begged her to wear it again. "Let them look." She had stopped eating. The pain in her abdomen had grown unbearable, her throat too swollen for food. Her hands shook when she tried to raise a cup. The swelling came next, a grotesque distension that made her appear cruelly as if she were pregnant. Her physicians working blind behind the screen of royal decorum called it dropsy, their word for any body drowning in its own fluids. Modern medicine would name it ascites, a sign that her liver or kidneys were failing, the result of decades of toxins and starvation and fear. The fluid pressed against her lungs. Each breath became an effort. But she refused the bed. Her ladies pleaded. Her counsellors, panicked by the absence of an heir, begged. Still she sat upright, propped on cushions on the floor, back against the wall, head sagging under the weight of the wig. "If I lie down," she said, "I shall never rise again." It was more than superstition. To lie flat would have made breathing nearly impossible. The fluid in her abdomen would have flooded her chest. But there was something deeper, older in that defiance. A lifetime of survival had trained her never to surrender position. To recline was to yield, to show weakness was to invite death. Even now, as her body demanded stillness, her will refused the horizontal. For days she drifted in and out of coherence. She muttered names: Dudley, Essex. Mary spoke to her father, her mother, her ghosts. Sometimes she laughed, sometimes prayed in Latin. Her ladies took turns supporting her as she dozed upright, afraid to let her fall. The fire burned day and night, but the air in the room carried the same sweet corruption the courtiers had noticed for months. Her Majesty's chambers must be aired daily, one note read in a secretary's trembling hand. They perfumed the curtains and burned incense, but the smell seeped through the scent of organs failing. Outside the sick-room politics churned. The Privy Council argued in whispers about succession. James VI of Scotland was the obvious choice, Mary Stuart's son, Protestant, politically convenient, but Elizabeth would not speak his name. Naming an heir, she had always believed, meant digging her own grave. It had happened to every monarch before her. Once the successor was chosen, the sovereign's life became expendable. Her silence was strategic until it became habit, then pathology. The kingdom held its breath, waiting for a dying woman's nod. When they asked again, she only shook her head. Sometimes she wept, though no one knew for whom. Others said she smiled faintly, as if amused by the panic around her. In the dim hours before dawn, one lady recorded her whisper, "The bed is a trap." Another claimed, she murmured, "There is a pit beneath it." Whether hallucination or metaphor, both were true. The bed had always been the most dangerous place in her life. Her mother's scaffold, her father's chamber of discarded wives, the marriage she had refused all her days. Beds were where women lost control of bodies, of kingdoms, of stories. She would not give it that victory. As February turned to March, her strength ebbed. She sat for hours without speaking, her eyes open but unseeing. The courtiers tiptoed through the corridors, terrified of both her death and her endurance. When at last she collapsed and could not be kept upright, they carried her to the bed she had resisted for weeks. The sheets were of white linen, the same colour as her old makeup, the same colour as surrender. She did not protest, she no longer had the breath. The archbishop knelt beside her, whispering prayers. Around him gathered the councillors already planning the transition. In the flicker of candles they watched for signs, any sign of acknowledgement. At last, when someone murmured the name of James of Scotland, she gave the smallest nod. It was enough. The machinery of succession creaked into motion even as her breathing slowed. Through the night she lingered, eyes open, lips moving without sound. One by one her attendants withdrew until only the few most trusted remained. As dawn came on March 24, 1603, her breath faltered and stopped. There were no final words, only the soft settling of fabric as the body that had held England together for 45 years finally let go. The door was locked immediately. Guards posted. The councillors ordered the body sealed before rigor mortis set in. When the women began to undress her, the last illusion peeled away the blackened sores, the grooves of the corset, the bloated belly, the smell of decay. They wrapped her quickly in cerecloth, soaked in wax and spice, sealed her in lead, and removed the witnesses. Within hours the coffin was closed. Outside London slept beneath a pale dawn. Messengers rode north to carry the news to Scotland. A reign that had turned a bankrupt island into a myth was over. The woman who had refused every bed of love, marriage, or sickness had finally lain down, but on her own terms, upright in spirit, eyes open, still defying the ordinary laws of rest. In the silence that followed, one of her ladies whispered the only epitaph that fit. She never yielded, not even to sleep. The dawn that ended her reign arrived without ceremony. No trumpets, no prayers, only the faint sound of a body exhaling for the last time. At first, the ladies thought she had drifted into another shallow sleep, the kind that had tricked them so often in the previous weeks. But when the stillness held, when no pulse stirred beneath the parchment skin, they began to understand. March 24th, 1603. The Virgin Queen was dead. The silence that followed was almost military. The women froze. One curtsied, another crossed herself, though such gestures had been forbidden for half a century. For a long moment no one dared to move. Then the oldest among them whispered the order that protocol demanded: close the door. Send for the council. Within minutes the machinery of monarchy reawakened. Guards sealed the corridors, servants were confined to quarters, the palace gates clanged shut. Outside London still slept, unaware that the heart of its government had stopped beating. Inside, the living began to choreograph the transfer of power, even as the air around the dead queen still trembled with heat. Royal death in Tudor England was not an ending, but a procedure, a ritual designed to convert mortality into continuity. There were rules for everything: how to verify the breath was gone, how to lift the body without desecration, which servants could speak, who must kneel, who must ride. The Lord Chamberlain was summoned first, then the Archbishop, then the Council. Each entered quietly, their footsteps muffled by layers of carpet. They bowed to the corpse as if it could still see them. "Speak of nothing, you see," came the order. It had been written down decades earlier, a clause in the royal household's emergency code. The fiction of eternal sovereignty could not tolerate gossip. The Queen was not to be dead until the state was ready to say she was. For now she was merely indisposed. In those few suspended hours, England existed in legal limbo, a country without a living monarch yet forbidden to name it so. The physicians confirmed what everyone already knew, pressing fingers to cold skin, whispering Latin prayers under their breath. The body was then washed in wine and wrapped in cerecloth soaked in resin and myrrh to delay decay. The face was veiled. By midday, carpenters arrived with the lead coffin that had been prepared years earlier, its dimensions measured from her coronation robes as if sovereignty could be standardized. They soldered it shut before nightfall. Outside the chamber, the council debated succession. Elizabeth had given only a gesture, an ambiguous nod toward James VI of Scotland, but in the language of power that was enough. Messengers were dispatched north under cover of darkness, carrying sealed letters naming him heir. By dawn on the 25th, James was already being hailed as King James I of England. The empire did not pause to mourn, it pivoted. Grief was postponed, scheduled like a ceremony. The Queen's personal seals were broken, her signet rings destroyed, her household dismissed. Every object she had touched now belonged to the state. The wardrobe inventories were locked, the cipher rooms sealed. Mourning was not permitted until the new reign had been proclaimed. In the hierarchy of Tudor order, emotion ranked below efficiency. By afternoon, heralds in black velvet rode through the city, trumpets bound in crape. At every crossroads they read aloud the formula drafted weeks in advance: Elizabeth, by the grace of God, Queen of England, France and Ireland, is dead. Long live King James, her lawful successor. The 2 sentences were to be delivered as one breath, so the realm would not even for an instant imagine itself ungoverned. The crowd knelt instinctively, some weeping, some merely watching. The age of Gloriana ended not with wailing but with paperwork. Back at Richmond Palace, the body remained under guard. Only a few women were allowed to stay with it through the night. They lit candles and sat in silence, the sound of their breathing mingling with the soft ticking of molten wax. Now and then one of them glanced at the veiled face searching for movement, half believing she might wake again and scold them for idleness. None came. By the second morning the scent of death had thickened despite the spices. The coffin was lifted and borne to Whitehall, where it would rest until the funeral procession could be staged an affair of orchestration and theatre as all things royal had been under Elizabeth's command. Her effigy, modelled in wax and dressed in her robes, would stand atop the coffin so that her people might still look upon the version of her they remembered, painted perfect untouched. In the council chambers, scribes prepared proclamations praising her glorious memory, even as they drafted new charters for James's reign. The pens did not stop. Power detests interruption. It requires rhythm. And so before her body had cooled, the signatures of the next world began to overwrite hers. No last words, no grand farewell, just the machinery of government sliding smoothly into place. That was her final lesson to England, that monarchy must survive. Its monarch, that control means never allowing silence to become chaos. As the Abbey bells tolled at dusk, the courtiers stepped outside into the cold March air. The Thames reflected a smear of crimson sky, the same colour as the wax, sealing the orders of succession. Behind them the palace windows glowed with candlelight around the sealed chamber. Inside, the Virgin Queen lay as she had lived, alone veiled, surrounded by rules. Within hours her death had already become history, and history as she had long understood can be ruled even from the grave. They did not wait for dawn. Before the cathedral bells could toll, before the city could wake, the keepers of the realm began their quiet work. The Queen's body, still warm, was not treated as a relic, but as a liability, a potential explosion of rumour in a world that lived on rumour. The chamber door was locked from the inside. Only 5 were permitted to stay her chief lady of the bedchamber, 2 physicians and 2 silent attendants with orders not to speak again of what they saw. The unbandaging began. Layer by layer they undid the symbols of Her Majesty, pearls, girdles, velvet linen. The mask that had defined her reign came away in pieces. Flakes of white paint clung to the sheets, strips of skin came with it. Beneath was not the face of Gloriana, nor even of an old woman, but something sore and darkened, where the lead and vinegar had long since eaten through flesh. Ulcers wept along her jawline. The skin on her neck and chest had turned a sickly grey-green, the same hue as oxidized metal. The stench, one witness later recalled, was enough to drive reason from the room. They pressed on professional, desperate to finish. When they unlaced the corset, a steel and whalebone fortress that had caged her, for nearly half a century, the flesh beneath bore deep, livid furrows. The ribs bowed inward. Some had fractured and fused in unnatural shapes. The marks were not mere impressions, but engravings, the blueprint of her armour carved into her own body. The physicians looked away. Then came the abdomen, bloated, stretched tight, glistening under the lamplight. Swollen like the moon in storm, one note in a later diary would say. Dropsy tumour abscess, none dared name it aloud. They worked fast. To delay was to invite discovery. Already the palace hummed with whispers. Already servants pressed their ears to keyholes hungry for scandal. In an age before newspapers' gossip was government. One careless phrase could travel from kitchen to tavern to court, transcribed into letters and duplicated by candlelight across the realm. The monarchy's authority depended on controlling not just succession but stewary. So the doctors were told what story to remember, that the Queen's body was intact, unblemished and serene. By midday the decision was made: no embalming, no viewing, no lingering. The coffin would be sealed before the day ended. Lead was chosen not merely for preservation, but for secrecy. Lead muffles. It contains both odour and rumour. Its weight deters curiosity. Its density silences decay. A wooden coffin could warp or crack, releasing the truth. A lead coffin made the body an idea, not an object. The workers hammered sheets of metal together under supervision, soldering seams, until the air inside was locked forever. The coffin gleamed, dull and featureless, like an ingot of empire. As they lowered the body into it, wrapped in cerecloth and silk, one physician crossed himself quietly, an act punishable by dismissal. They filled the remaining space with spices, not out of reverence, but to mask what no perfume could hide. When the lid was sealed, the sound rang through the chamber like a verdict. Outside, the courtiers rehearsed the official narrative. Her Majesty passed peacefully, the proclamation would say, her countenance unchanged and fair as in life. Scribes copied it by hand onto parchment, the ink barely dry, before messengers galloped away to distribute the illusion. In London's alehouses, pamphleteers speculated in verse about divine translation and angelic ascension. None would be allowed to mention sores swelling or the strange shape of her torso. Those who had seen too much were quietly dismissed, sent to country estates or distant postings. 2 of the attending doctors were dead within the year. Fever, the records read. Sudden. The speed of burial was itself a language. To move a royal body swiftly was to assert control, to signal that the machinery of rule was unbroken. That nothing lingered to rot or question. Delay was dangerous. Delay suggested dispute. Henry VIII's funeral had been delayed, and a gossip had turned it into legend, his coffin leaking royal corruption that dogs licked from the floor. The council would not repeat that humiliation. Elizabeth's interment was to be an exercise in velocity from deathbed to lead coffin to Westminster within days, before anyone could speak of what they had seen. In this choreography of silence, every gesture carried meaning. The lead sealed truth. The guards at the door signalled sanctity, not secrecy. The dismissal of servants read as mercy, not containment. The official painters were ordered to sketch the effigy that would stand on her coffin, smooth, radiant, unscarred. Even her smell was rewritten as the perfume of sanctity, and so the myth survived its autopsy. Within a week, the Queen's body had become pure symbol again, her decay converted into propaganda, her human remnants into relics of continuity. The courtiers who had vomited behind the curtains now told tales of angelic repose. The chroniclers who had smelled corruption wrote of celestial calm. In manuscript after manuscript, the miracle repeated. The Virgin Queen died as she had lived, perfect, serene, untouched. History, of course, absorbed the performance. The rapid burial, the sealed coffin, the scattered witnesses all became evidence not of concealment but of reverence. Later centuries would mistake the speed for dignity, but the truth was simpler and sharper. The regime moved fast because raw rot travels faster. The monarchy could not afford the scent of mortality. In the alchemy of power, lead was not just metal, it was narrative heavy enough to sink the truth beyond reach, yet soft enough to bear the engraving of a single eternal lie. And somewhere beneath the marble in that dark, airtight coffin, the body that had once ruled the daylight still lies locked in the silence she built around herself. The mask is gone, the paint dissolved, but the lead holds steady, a final casing of empire, a last act of statecraft. Because in the end, even death had to obey her rule, speak of nothing you see. History loves neat endings, and so it built one for her. A golden age, a virgin queen, an empire conceived in purity. These were the words the chroniclers chose to keep. What they left out was the cost. Every inch of that radiance was paid for in flesh, the bone bent by corsets, the skin burned by lead, the organs drowned in their own poisons. Her body was the altar on which England laid its hunger for myth. She understood this bargain and accepted it. To rule in a man's world, she had to become an idea instead of a woman. The idea outlived her. When James VI rode south to inherit her throne, he entered a kingdom already transformed into the theatre. The transition was seamless because the story had prepared the stage. England did not mourn, it applauded. The pageants praising the new king were decorated with images of the old queen ascending into the heavens, radiant, untouched, her crown blazing like the morning star. The legend had consumed the corpse. Power, having fed on her life, now feasted on her memory. This is what power does. It converts suffering into architecture, pain into precedent. The rituals that silenced her laid incense. The sealed coffin became templates for how states manage every uncomfortable truth that follows. The monarchy learned from her death the same lesson she had learned from her life: never let the body speak. Institutions metabolize agony by turning it into pageant. They coat it in ceremony, file it under reverence, and teach generations to call it glory. That is why Westminster remains closed. The coffin is not sealed because of piety, it is sealed because piety is useful. To open it would be to expose the simple unroyal decay of the woman who once embodied divinity. It would force the living to admit that the foundations of their myth are organic, soft, corruptible human. To lift that lid would not just unmake Elizabeth, it would unmake the story England tells about itself, and yet every myth deserves an audit. Not to desecrate, but to understand. To look under the lid is not to diminish her, It is to honour what she endured. The woman who turned her own torment into sovereignty deserves the mercy of recognition. Beneath the paint and the armour and the choreography, she was the greatest performer of survival history as ever recorded. Her true monument is not marble or portraiture, it is the uneasy question she left behind. What must be hidden for power to appear holy? To study her honestly is to confront our own complicity in the way we polish pain into heritage. We still do it, still build nations from unspoken bodies, still crown myths that depend on someone else's silence. Every sealed coffin is a mirror waiting for its moment of courage. The question is not whether we will open it, but whether we can bear what breathes out when we do. Perhaps in that imagined moment we would find no scandal, no monstrous secret, only the outline of a woman who refused to lie down until history itself made her. A woman who gave her body to the idea of endurance so completely that centuries later we still call endurance by her name. The quiet historians would tell you to remember her properly. You must not stop at the portraits. You must trace the bruises, count the grooves in the ribs, feel the weight of the lead. Then step back and look again at the brightness that replaced her. Ask what we worship when we call it glory. Ask what mercy we owe the bodies that made it possible. The marble floor above her tomb is smooth now, worn by 400 years of footsteps, pilgrims, tourists, believers in the story. Each step polishes the stone a little more, until even grief becomes reflection. The legend endures because it is useful, the truth waits because it is necessary. Elizabeth's reign ended in silence, but silence is not peace. It is only the sound of power catching its breath. And so the task falls to us, the living readers, the late witnesses, to listen under the marble, to remember that every empire begins with a body, and that the most sacred lids are sometimes the ones that most need lifting. Because what power hides history owes, and what we choose to see at last is the measure of our mercy. History often disguises its deepest truths beneath ceremony. The story of Elizabeth Tudor, painted white as marble, corseted into power, sealed in lead, is not only a chronicle of one monarch's endurance, it is a mirror held up to all of us. Her life reminds us how easily the pursuit of perfection can become a form of self-erasure, how the masks we craft to protect our strength can end up suffocating it. Elizabeth was by every measure extraordinary. She ruled for nearly half a century, guided a fractured kingdom through rebellion, plague and invasion, and built the foundations of a modern state. Yet her triumph came at a terrible cost. To remain unassailable, she sacrificed the very things that made her human sleep health, love, even the comfort of her own reflection. Her immaculate image, polished daily by poison, became both her armour and her slow undoing. She lived and died for an idea of control so absolute that it left no room for mercy, not even toward herself. That is the quiet lesson her story leaves us. Power without tenderness collapses inward. We all wear versions of her mask, professional, social, emotional, built to reassure others that we are fine, invincible, in command. We lace our modern corsets in different ways, deadlines, expectations, comparisons, the silent demand to appear composed while something inside us aches. Like Elizabeth, we fear that if we let the facade slip, the world will see too much. Yet her ending shows that the greater danger lies in never letting it slip at all. The refusal to rest, to admit pain, to show vulnerability, corrodes slowly and visibly, until what remains is performance rather than presence. Her sealed coffin is more than a historical curiosity. It is a metaphor for how societies and individuals hide the cost of their ideals. The institutions that refuse to open her tomb are the same instincts that keep us from opening our own fear of what truth might undo, fear that honesty will dismantle the myths that make us feel safe. But growth, whether personal or collective, depends on the courage to lift those lids. Only when we face what we've concealed, our frailty, our exhaustion, our grief, can we learn to build something healthier in its place. Elizabeth's reign also reminds us of a subtler wisdom that legacy is not perfection, but persistence. She ruled not because she was flawless, but because she kept standing when history expected her to fall. In that stubbornness there is a strange grace. Life asks the same of us, not to be untouchable, but to keep showing up, to keep choosing purpose, even when the body or the heart trembles. In the end, the Virgin Queen's truest lesson is one of reconciliation between image and truth, endurance and compassion, strength and surrender. We honour her not by preserving the myth of unbreakable grandeur, but by learning from her humanity the brilliance that inspired millions and the pain she could never voice. Every age must decide what it will do with its own sealed coffins. To open them is not an act of disrespect, but of mercy. because what power hides life demands we finally see. Thank you so much for keeping me company tonight. Don't forget to subscribe so we can share many more stories together.